Grip it and rip it, right, guys?
It's it's the motto to live by. Send it is another way to say that, I guess.
Quoting the legendary Dave Collum. I mean, that's how he always starts off the conversation. Grip it and rip it. And Marty, if I'm not mistaken, didn't you guys record a 3 hour one and you had to yell mercy before
I had to yell
Dave?
mercy. I had to go to the bathroom. Unfortunately for me, I don't have the gumption to pee in a coffee pot while I'm recording. I know Dave. It's not past Dave. He'll do that. And also, he recorded in a room, and we were recording mid-afternoon, and the sun went down. I literally couldn't see him. I was like, Dave, I can't see you. Your dog's snoring, and we've been here for 3.5 hours, so I have to go to the bathroom. It's been great.
Oh, well, he comes on here a lot, and obviously I appreciate all the conversations I have with him. I also appreciate the fact that you two are willing to come on, and we were talking offline a little bit about in my view what's relevant, what's not relevant, and it was funny because seeing seeing certain journalists that are like maybe covering the border or covering the LGBTQ or the trans movements. Um, there's not much going on, especially the border. Like there's nothing going on at the border right now. But Marty, I mean, you're very well. You kind of bounce around different interests, and so do I. And it's a good thing because what we're about to talk about, I think, is one of the most relevant, if not the most relevant, that's not getting a lot of attention.
Yeah, and I think that's the beauty of being an independent creator. Like, I never view myself as a journalist. I got into
Me either.
what I do to educate people about Bitcoin. Like I was telling you before we hit record, talked about Bitcoin only for years, and there's plenty of exciting things happening in Bitcoin. But I made the conscious decision, particularly during COVID, to branch out into other tangential topics, which are somewhat related to Bitcoin. So a lot of macroeconomics. And during COVID, following the Orwellian lockdowns and the forced um, medical uh, procedures and the attack on bodily autonomy during that period, and have ventured into other things like UAP stuff. But I think what affords people like me and you the ability to do that is the fact that we're independent. A lot of these journalists work for bigger media outlets that give them a beat, like, hey, go cover the border, go cover the trans stuff, and they become sort of beholden to that beat at some point, and they don't have the flexibility that we do. So I view what I do as just me following my curiosity, and it's never boring, and being in control of what you cover is very feel very fortunate to be able to do that.
Well, and Mel, you were saying, people are still hanging on to the fact that, some of these issues they're just not willing to relinquish. And what did you say you saw on HBO?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's some sense that there's been like a mandate or a torch pass, or we've moved beyond certain things. But I do think there's still very significant portions of the population that are really just still digging in their heels and saying, "Hey, no, 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 this isn't ready." I had been flipping through the channels. I'd mentioned I saw HBO, some documentary series. I think it was called Trans World or something like that, and I was like, "What is this? This has got to be some woke program, documentary." And sure enough, it was, and it was basically the segment that I saw, which was like a 10-minute segment, and then I had to turn it off, was it was all about like an 8 or 9 or 10-year-old boy who thought he was a girl who was dressing trans, and he was essentially orchestrating um, a myriad of adults, including FBI agents, police officers, his parents. I mean, literally like a third grader making decisions that all of these adults were following based on catering to his transhood. So apparently I think this was somewhere in Gainesville or Orlando. There was going to be a LGBTQ parade. The kid wanted to march in it. FBI agents had come to the mother's house to say, we have information. There could be some anti-LGBTQ forces, could be dangerous for your child. Everybody's like asking this child, like, what do you think? Do you want to walk in the parade? Should you not walk in the parade? The mother's listening, the FBI agents are listening, there were local police involved. And it was all about like how this 10-year-old saw himself. And he had lipstick on and dyed hair. And it was like a 10-year-old boy who believed he was a girl. And I'm like, maybe he truly does believe he's a girl, but being a student of human nature, like especially children that age, they love attention. And if people learn that by saying I'm trans, and if I say I want to color my hair and do my nails, all of a sudden I get half a dozen adults, swarming me to get my thoughts on, do I feel safe walking in this parade? They're going to do that. And so this is still, I think, a psychosis that's out there. This is still a real effect. I don't think it's gone away. I think you're seeing it, to take it back to my, forte, economics. You're seeing it in like University of Michigan surveys, data, where like you dig deep into them and you say, okay, here's the inflation expectations, and then you break down by party who's saying what, and it's like anybody who's like in the Democratic Party, all of a sudden their inflation expectations went from 2% in October and now they're at 6%. And so you're seeing it hit economic data. You're seeing it hit, I think there are CFO data. There's a big Duke CFO study. I think when you've got people that are really under like Trump derangement syndrome, they're starting to incorporate that into their economic outputs. You're seeing it in like analysts from big banks, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, CFO studies, University of Michigan consumer sentiment. And so what you're seeing is today is a perfect example as we record this on Thursday, 327, a great jobless reports, nothing to see there, economy strong, labor market's moving on. And yet you've got all these sentiment surveys saying like everything's collapsing. Bullshit. Nothing's collapsing. Like everything is moving along fine, but everybody is so scared. And I think a lot of that is people who just want to believe that with Trump making decisions, we're heading for a collapse. And that's their mindset. And they're going to keep saying that in every sentiment survey we see from here to high water.
Yeah, well, and I didn't see that this morning. So you read something where they were like portraying it as doom and gloom and everything's falling apart and
No, so there's something called the University of Michigan Consumer Confidence Survey, and it has certain things like it embedded inflation expectations. And so literally there are graphs that people have created, and they're just crossed like that. So it's like if you're a Republican like a year ago, your expectation was 5, 6% inflation because we were under the Biden regime and everything that's happening. And then if you're a Democrat now, post Trump, your expectation is 5, 6. And so a lot of these inflation expectations are like 5, 6%. And Powell was asked about this in his press conference last week after the Federal Reserve meeting. And they were like, what do you think about increasing inflation expectations? And he didn't, paint the picture as blatantly as I did about partisan sentiment. But he basically said, when you're looking at inflation expectations from these sentiment surveys, there's a lot of, consumer political thought built into it. And what he said was a better gauge is look at what they call like 5, 10 year break evens. Like, we don't need to get into what these are, but they're basically market instruments where people put down real money on specifically what they believe is the inflation number. And these are typically just referred to as inflation break evens. And if you look at the inflation break evens on a 5, 10 year in the marketplace where people are putting down real money, they're at 2.5, 3%. Like they're not anywhere near the sentiment surveys. So there's a big divorce between what's happening in the marketplace. And this is, as I mentioned, we had jobless numbers come out today. Very good. Totally typical of what you had seen for the last year and a half. And there's a big divorce between these hard data and the sentiment data. And I think that a lot of the sentiment data is being completely skewed by anti-Trump beliefs, and that's feeding into the equity markets. And when we look at what's really going on in the real economy, we're seeing a couple of things. We're seeing the largest government spending ever. We just had government numbers come out. This is the monthly Treasury statement last month. $840 billion deficit so far this fiscal year. versus 532 billion at the same time last year under Biden, a 39% increase. So we are running government deficits 40% greater than Biden did. And people are talking about government spending collapsing. No, government spending is not collapsing. You're not seeing anything. I mean, I'll shut up because I want to hear what you guys have to say. But I just think that all this stuff about tariffs and government spending collapsing, like, I think it's a bunch of market mind games of people with Trump derangement syndrome. The economy is doing quite well, thank you very much. Labor's doing great. Jobless claims are great. Uh, Jobs reports have been strong. And as far as people worrying about federal layoffs and government spending collapsing, we have the biggest deficit in the history of the United States 5 months into a fiscal year that we have ever seen. So there's a disconnect.
Marty, go ahead. Do you want to say something?
I saw one survey that was trying to gauge the amount of people that thought they were going to be laid off in the next 6 months, and that was inflated too. That was, I think, highs not seen since 2020 during the lockdowns. And so I agree. And the inflation, it's funny that people are throwing their arms up in the air and expecting it to go up when you consider the meme at the beginning of the year, right before Trump or right after he got inaugurated, but people were cherry picking data, egg prices, which have collapsed pretty significantly. That was something that the left was running with right after Trump's inauguration, is we can't even afford eggs. But it turns out that that price spike at the end of last year was due to the fact that the Biden admin went out and forced farmers to cull a lot of their herds, and I think Trump may have reversed that, and so egg prices have recovered pretty significantly. And yeah, there is certainly a disconnect, and it's manifesting in something that for the last 2 weeks I've been calling Luigi populism too, which I think is what we're seeing with the attacks on Tesla, which blows my mind that you have a subset of the American population that is actively going out there and keying cars, wiping their asses on cars, blowing up Teslas because Elon Musk is a part of Doge and is trying to highlight where fraud, waste, and grift exist in the federal government, which everybody should want to highlight and get out of the government. And Obama was running on that during his second term. And there is this disconnect. This whatever Trump does, the people with TDS are never going to be satisfied. And it's, I think, socially a big problem that I don't know if you can fix it, but I think there does need to be some focus on highlighting, like, you people are objectively crazy in terms of your reaction to everything that's going on. The numbers, as Mel just described, do not comport with the way you're posturing and what you believe is actually happening. But the government spending too. I mean, obviously that is a lagging effect from the Biden administration. So it will be interesting to see how things play off if people begin to put their foot on the brake pedal of the madness and recognize that everything is somewhat okay. There are some other economic data points, not in consumer sentiment, but just looking at the raw data when it comes to like charge-off rates. And you saw the headline last week with Klarna and DoorDash doing their partnership to do payday loans for burrito deliveries. And so there is definitely a subsect of the economy that is struggling under the weight of inflation that built up between 2020 and 2024. So yeah, it's very confusing. That's why I like to focus on the Bitcoin stuff and just hone in and stay narrowly focused on that, because I think that is something that can produce a long-term solution for a lot of these problems for people on both sides of the aisle.
This episode is brought to you by McIlvaney Financial Group. Their advisors bring a depth of knowledge and experience that allow them to serve their clientele with care, ensuring their financial needs are met now and in the future. Personally, I'm not saying cash is worthless, but you can see what's happening. It's worth less every year. Gold is the opposite. Click on the promo link in the show notes or go to www.mcilvaney.com/coffeeandamike. You know, I had Porter Stansberry on not that long ago, and I've seen him put this out on X, and I'm paraphrasing, but the federal government will never cut a dollar out of a budget. They're not interested in doing that. And so, it makes me wonder with Doge, what is the goal of it? And I also come back to, and I know people are probably tired of me saying it, but my conversation that I'd had with Matt Smith last month in regards to, are we at the end of the financial system here and moving into, is Doge to show that there's so much corruption, there's so much rot in all these institutions and agencies that they can't be salvaged. And that's the goal of it. So then they can move into, maybe privatization, stable coins, gold, whatever that is. Is that what their objective is with all this?
I wouldn't be surprised. Go ahead, Mel. I saw your.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, here's the thing with these cuts, okay? I mean, Trump can come up on a State of Address or State of the Union address or State of the Union like address. I guess it wasn't officially a State of the Union, but he can list 25 things that average $10 billion a piece. Okay, 10 times 25, right? 250 billion, right? Drop in the bucket. It doesn't do anything. You have to look at what are we spending our money on. I posted something on Twitter yesterday. It was a recent breakdown of Veterans Affairs spending, right? And as people understand, like once we hit September 11th and we had all of these people going off to foreign wars, Veterans Affairs expenses was going to explode. And it goes from about 70 billion in 2025 dollars. So that's inflation adjusted. In 2000, it was probably like 30 billion. Goes from like 30 billion to 400 billion, right? Veterans Affairs, right? That's nothing that we can cut, right? Like, who wants to say, you know what, we need to save money. You lost your leg. Sorry, we're not going to help you with your rehabilitation, right? We're not going to cut veterans benefits. They're at 400 billion and rising. We've got interest expense at $1 trillion and rising. We've got Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, that Trump himself has says we're not going to cut those benefits. Okay, we're going to get rid of fraud, waste, and abuse. I saw some really interesting articles about people that had moved and they filed for Medicaid in multiple states and there were double payments. All right, let's add all of that stuff up. Maybe we get 500 billion. And then you think about, well, just in the last year, we've had 20 billion increase in Veterans Affairs, 70 billion increase in Medicaid, given inflation, 100 billion increase in Social Security. There goes that whole 500 billion savings. And so at the end of the day, I've said this since before Trump was inaugurated, we're going to have the largest non-recession, non-war, non-pandemic deficit ever in fiscal year 2025 that we've ever had. There's not going to be some $1 trillion decrease in the deficit. I mean, like Elon and these people can keep talking about it until they're blue in the face. They're going to decrease the deficit by $1 trillion. I'm telling you, they're nuts. And if they do it, if they really pull $1 trillion out of the economy, out of government spending, they're going to collapse the stock market. And I give full credit to people like Luke Gromen or somebody like that say, look, once you take away that impetus and then you collapse spending, you collapse equity prices, you collapse capital gains, you collapse economic activity, then you collapse government receipts, meaning government, income, and you actually blow out the deficit. So if we just all of a sudden really did $1 trillion in deficit reduction, we're going to actually increase our deficit because we're going to decrease our receipts so much. So I said something to this in a tweet yesterday. It was from Peter Schiff. He had talked about how there's no way to rejigger the China-U.S. dynamics without a major meltdown and recession. I said, no, there is a way to do it, but it's not easy and it's going to take time. It's going to take a 1980 to 1992 period where we had Reagan 1, Reagan 2, Bush 1, a 12-year period. Like, we need, I don't know if it needs to be Vance or whoever, but we need Bush and Vance 2 until 2036 to slowly take away the manufacturing from China, but significantly and steadily. And it's a 10, 12-year process. It's not something we're going to do in 6 months. Like, we're not going to just change the whole global flow of capital and manufacturing in 2 years. And what I said in my reply tweet was, we need to have the light at the end of the tunnel be very clear by like 2027, in ahead of the 2028 election. So we don't have in 2028 like a Democratic sweep the way we had a Republican sweep that just reverses everything. If Trump can make real progress and get companies and Hyundai and BMW and Mercedes, and they're building plants, and all of a sudden manufacturing jobs are up, 50,000 jobs a month. If we can start to see that by 2027, like, people will say, you know what, this is working. Then we get a Republican president, maybe a Republican Congress in 2028, and we keep doing it like we did 80 to 92. By 2036, we can have a whole new economy without a meltdown, without a collapse. But this idea that Trump's going to just wave a magic wand and everything's going to be fixed in the next 12 to 18 months is ludicrous. And so, I think that's where we're at, is the market's realizing there's this tension between Trump wanting to make a real change, fundamental change to the global economy, but we need to do it in a way that doesn't collapse the system, because if we do it too fast, we are going to have a collapse in tax receipts that's going to blow out the deficit. It's going to spike yields, and it's going to create essentially Great Depression 2.0. So they need to be careful. It's threading the needle, I've called it, and it's possible, but it's not easy. And I think that's the evolution that we're going to see over time here. And like I said, it's not going to be easy, but I think it's possible, and I think it has to be done, or we lose our sovereignty as a nation and we collapse and become dependent on Chinese manufacturing.
Well, and I think too, Dave Collum said this as well a couple days ago in regards to like the Hyundai dealership or the Hyundai manufacturing. That won't even be up and running probably by the end of Trump's term. You can't build that in a week and just employ and get it going. But yet people, the masses, I sometimes wonder, either people have their heads in the sand, or they don't have the stomach for where we're actually at with all this. And to what your point is, Mel, these things just take time, and it's not going to turn around in 6 months.
No, it's a condition of particularly my generation, millennials, growing up in this high velocity trash economy where everything's based off of quarterly financials, month to month progress, people looking at what the central bank, what the Federal Reserve is doing at every one of the FOMC meetings. We've literally been conditioned to expect this rapid feedback of economic activity, data, and results. And that's, to your point, Mel, that's a lot of what I've been preaching on my show, and why Bitcoin, I think, is essential to part of the solution, which is helping people lower their time preference. Like, these are things that are worthwhile and worth doing, and anything worth doing doesn't happen overnight. And I think, Mel, when you were on my show a couple of weeks ago, that's what we discussed. It's part of threading this needle is getting out there and really communicating, being over communicative of the plan, and sort of hand holding people as they're making all these policy changes and setting us up for this transition that is likely going to take over a decade. And I think they've been doing a pretty good job with that so far. I mean, Dissent going out there with the American dream isn't let them eat flat screens, I think was an incredible meme to basically put into people's minds. Like, yeah, you're right. Like, it's cool that I can buy a $300 flat screen, but that's not the American dream. I want to be able to prosper, build a family, have a career, and not have to take out a payday loan to get Shake Shack delivered to my house.
I think if I step back and I was like a campaign manager for Trump and I saw what I wanted to do economically, I would say, okay, here's what you do. You go in the election, you just promise everything's going to be great. Because if you start trying to get nuanced and tell people it's going to take this time and that time, you're going to get bogged down in details. Then what you do, you get elected, and then you start breaking people in, right? You start letting them know, okay, this is serious, but maybe, he pushes so hard, then he pulls back a little bit. Like, I think what he's trying to do is so difficult that, the fact that the S&P is down like 4% year on date is actually pretty dang good, right? And as of a couple days ago, the S&P at one point was down like 1.5%. And I think to start off the week, the Dow Jones Industrial was actually positive for 2025. So people need to take a step back. Like, we haven't had a market collapse, right? When the Dow literally on Monday was up year to date, we haven't had any equity collapse. But what does happen when you see a 10% equity collapse is you see how levered we are now to the financial economy. Like, in the 40s or the 50s or whatever, when people work for companies, they got defined benefit pensions. Stock market could go up, down 10% like nothing. Now the stock market S&P came down 10% peak to trough, and people are acting like there's a crash. We have got this hyper financialized world where the S&P, I've said it before, it's a Ponzi scheme, it's the national pension scheme. You know, this cannot be allowed to collapse. And so I think what we're going to do is we're going to have Trump and we're going to have Bessent and all these people work throughout this period, especially this first 6 months of the administration, hand holding people. Marty, you said it, hand holding people that we are going through a major global transition because we have to. Because if we don't, we're literally going to collapse. We're going to go to $50 trillion in debt, where deficit to GDPs are 8%, where 10-year treasury yields go to 6%, and net interest expense paid by the government goes to 2 trillion, and it starts taking up 50% of tax receipts. Like, that's the path we're on if we continue the Biden-Harris plan. Like, the Democrats, if we kept doing everything that the Biden-Harris plan called for another 4 or 5 years, we were literally going to just blow up. There was no question about it. And so there needs to be some pain. Does that pain need to be 1929 to 1939 depression pain? No. Could it be if it's handled improperly? Yes. But if it's handled correctly, it can be drawn out, systematic, like I said, a 10 to 12 year phase of rejiggering. And then I think call me crazy optimistic, but I think because of nuclear weapons, there's a chance we could get through this without some sort of a global war. Like China doesn't want World War III. Putin doesn't want World War III. Like, people want to figure out a way. Let's figure out a way to make it all work. Like, maybe I'm the only like optimistic person that thinks everybody can get together. Democrats, Republicans, Russians, Chinese. Like, eventually everybody's got to understand it's in their best interest if we all figure out a way to make this work without the economy collapsing. And if we do that, we're great. Now, there's also a real chance we don't, and then we're in World War III and kind of God help us all. But I'm leaning towards, I think we're going to figure a way out of it, but it's going to be crazy. And I do think, as I've always said before, it's going to be inflationary, and things like gold and Bitcoin are going to be the best performing assets for the next 10 years.
So being that to this, I mean, we're in the unknown right now with all this, right? We've never been through something quite a scenario like this before. So it's hard to say, right? What does my friend Matt Bracken say? You can train to tame a tiger all day long, but until you start to do it or attempt to ride it, it's a whole new ball game. So what they're attempting to do by threading the needle here, and slowly, right, slowly trying to bring the plane down, it could also backfire, and this whole thing could crash.
Yeah, I mean, definitely it could. And I mean, I think it's difficult. I mean, I don't know, Marty, I know you're involved there in Austin with a lot of, companies on the frontier of what's happening with Bitcoin, blockchain type stuff. I mean, are what are you seeing in your real world economy world of being a venture capitalist in Austin? Like, are deals happening? Are there investors out there? I mean, is the economy collapsing, or is there appetite to figure out ways to, make returns on investment?
I think broader venture is struggling to raise money because they raised a bunch in 2020, 2021 when rates went to zero. All this money came in and they raised a bunch of funds and haven't returned any cash. But that's beginning to turn. And like we're in a very, we like where we sit at 1031, being focused on Bitcoin companies because the founders are Bitcoiners that understand that Bitcoin is the hurdle rate. And so they really build their businesses with that in mind. And so we find lean teams that already have revenue, are profitable. We had Fold just go public last month, and they're incorporating Bitcoin treasury. They already not incorporating, they have incorporated a Bitcoin treasury strategy. And I think that's working out well for them. But like Austin, outside of the real estate market, which is correcting right now, which I think is a combination of people that moved here during COVID being like, all right, I'm going to go home. Things are good back home now, and they built a ton of inventory during COVID. And so I think there's a lot of supply coming to market, but like the town is buzzing. You've got Tesla here, they're moving the X headquarters here. You have the whole comedy scene. Like there is a ton of activity going on, and I'm very optimistic about the state of American ingenuity, particularly in the tech sector. What's happening with AI? What's happening with Bitcoin? But in terms of like going back to manufacturing this soft landing and threading the needle. And Michael, there certainly is a potential for this to blow up in everybody's face. But as Mel said, like we continue down the path that we were going on, it was going to blow up anyway. And so you have to take extreme measures. You have to think creatively to try to save the situation. So the status quo of just continuing down the road of wasteful spending, doing the Green New Deal and kneecapping the energy sector and really attacking private industry was going to lead to a collapse. And so we're put in a situation where we have to try to fix it, and there is going to be some threading of the needle necessary, and there is a chance it could blow up. But this is the much more optimal path to take, in my opinion. You gotta shoot for the fences to try to fix this. And in terms of what we're focused on at 1031 and we like how I personally view Bitcoin's role in helping manufacture this soft landing is basically re-collateralizing, particularly the credit markets with better collateral in the form of Bitcoin. And so Mel, like equity markets, the economy has become hyper financialized, and Bitcoin represents the great definancialization where people have been forced into equity markets, real estate, commercial real estate, because they're trying to outperform inflation. So they've been forced to put their wealth into what I would deem as suboptimal store value assets in the form of equity indices and real estate. And what we're beginning to see happen as Bitcoin turns 16 and it becomes accepted by the federal government as an industry that is going to be supported, and we're going to try to figure out a way how to integrate it into the economy, is on the private side, at least private credit. You have the opportunity. We're beginning to see it. So we helped stand up a company called Battery Finance, and this is a company that's spun out of a credit fund that's been around for a while, has been a part of $50 billion in credit deals over the last decade and a half, new market capital. And their bread and butter is underwriting commercial real estate and energy deals. And so what they're doing with Battery is just applying what they did at New Market with structured credit, but adding a Bitcoin component where they did their first deal in Philadelphia, Bank Street Court, which was this building that needed to be refinanced. Battery put up the capital to refinance it. They paid off the existing mortgage, put $2 million aside for renovations and reinvestment in the property, and then another $1.5 million, I believe, of cash from that deal was put into Bitcoin that sits within the loan structure over that 10-year loan. And as basically the thesis that Battery has is that as a credit fund, they would prefer to have this dual collateralized structure where you have the commercial real estate and the Bitcoin sitting together, because as time goes on, who knows what happens? It's likely that they're going to continue to debase the currency. The real estate will likely go up in value, but it may not. But Bitcoin, we believe, will go up significantly over the course of 10 years. And so the equity portion of your asset with the commercial real estate and Bitcoin is hypercharged with Bitcoin. And slowly but surely over time, as more of these deals happen, you begin to replace the collateral of these credit products, which traditionally in this example is commercial real estate, a building, which is a consumable good. Entropy, it's beholden to the whims of entropy. Buildings are not meant to store value; they're meant to be consumed, and they break down, and the walls need to be painted, and you got to pay taxes and do all the
They get
maintenance.
depreciation.
Yeah, they get depreciation, but you replace that collateral with Bitcoin, which is perfectly scarce, perfectly liquid. You can send it over the internet, and you begin to recapitalize basically the credit system in the United States with better collateral. And so you have a mechanism to begin to refinance all these loans, sprinkle in some Bitcoin, and essentially recapitalize the system slowly but surely. Similarly, it'll probably take 10, 12 years to get this to scale, where you have both borrowers and lenders that end up in a spot 10 years from now where the equity is in a better asset, and they're both able to make their money and do what they want to do within the economy by replacing suboptimal collateral assets with Bitcoin. Sorry if that was rambly there.
No. So let me ask then. Do you see then a privatization, a potential either gold standard or stable coin, where this collateral or these types of assets would be attached to that in the future in this new system, whatever that may be?
I don't think. I think Bitcoin is unique for this specific use case. When you think about it, again, going back to the fact that it's digital, scarce, and it's perfect collateral. So like whether if you do that with gold or stable coins, like stable coins are beholden to the whims of the central bank and the treasury. Like it's likely that they're going to have to print more money, and so the purchasing power of that stable coin is going to decrease over time. Gold, sort of hard to get physical gold in these structures. Bitcoin's perfect though. You send it to a wallet that can be audited on chain. God forbid the borrower gets behind on the loan, they can't pay it back. The lender is able to immediately liquidate that Bitcoin and get their principal back, or at least part of their principal in this deal, very quickly. So they get the Bitcoin principal back immediately. The commercial real estate, that's another question. It could take months, years to figure out how to sell that asset to somebody to recover your principal. So that is what I'm focused on. I think the intersection of Bitcoin and credit markets is a big theme that many people are missing. We're at the beginning stages of the Bitcoinization of finance, where you slowly but surely again reintroduce better collateral into the system in the form of Bitcoin, and that opens up the ability for sane prices to come back to these assets. Particularly real estate, I think, is the big one to go after initially, because you know that the housing affordability crisis is real, and that crisis is driven by the fact that people are using real estate as a store value asset to escape inflation, whereas it should be a consumable good. And so 10, 12 years from now, as we slowly switch out collateral in these credit products from real estate to Bitcoin, the monetary premium that exists in the real estate market should fall, and prices should fall, and people should have affordable houses, and hopefully Bitcoin proliferates and they have better store value asset to put their money in instead of real estate.
Mel, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I think Marty, that's awesome color and very, specific ways that I think if we just kind of take one step back is what's happening, which is the economy and the global economy is recognizing the need that the global monetary system be backed by something like what we would call a neutral reserve asset, something that cannot be just printed in a fiat realm on the whims of a politician, because there's just a lot of like fundamental philosophical flaws. I think on my Twitter account, I call myself financial philosopher. Like I love financial history. I love, everything that's happened in the economy is so fascinating to me. From when you look at like World War One and the gold standard, how that fell away, revaluations, the interactions between the pound and the dollar, and the restructuring of the system post Bretton Woods, and then what happened in 1971 when the gold standard was taken away. And I think what we've learned from 1971 to 2025, which is 54 years now, is that if you have a purely fiat system where there is no neutral, like reserve asset, disciplinarian in the house, when there's no disciplinarian in the house, you're just going to get governments spending money like crazy. And we've seen it in the last 50 years plenty of times in emerging markets like Argentina or Chile or Zimbabwe, where like their currencies hyperinflate and they go bust. And what I believe we're at now is that we're starting to see this happen in the major sovereign nations of the world, whether it's Japan, Germany, United States, even to some extent into China. Like we're basically seeing that this fiat world of we can just print and print and print and have no endpoint, it eventually ends up in the same place that it did for the Roman Empire and the Weimar Republic. It's all going to end up in the same place, and we need to replace it. And there's part of a economic group, especially led, I would say, by the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and others, that want gold to be part of this neutral reserve asset. There's also a Bitcoin movement to make gold a reserve asset again. I mean, excuse me, make Bitcoin part of this reserve asset. And I think there's nothing that says you can't have both. There's nothing that says you can't use gold and silver, right? When the country was started, we had a bimetallic standard. We had gold and silver. There's nothing to say you can't have a bi asset standard of Bitcoin and gold that are the neutral reserve assets in the world. It worked for hundreds of years before. It can work again. And what it does is it keeps monetary discipline. Now, as a financial philosopher, one quick thing I want to say is like, the problem post 29 depression was we really needed to expand the money supply, but the nature of a physical gold, it was like constraining. And so what we need to do is we went from a pure gold standard to basically almost a fiat standard. And now what we need to do, we need to find something that's like anchored in a neutral reserve asset like Bitcoin and gold, but also allows for currencies to revalue versus based on trade deficits, based on economic needs. This is what John Maynard Keynes in 1944 at Bretton Woods suggested. He called it the Bancor. It was going to be this neutral asset. It's something that's similar to what the IMF has tried to develop with their SDRs, their special drawing rights, but nobody's quite nailed it yet on what this like neutral reserve asset monetary base is that's different from like a really restrictive pure gold standard and then just a pure unrestricted, undisciplined fiat standard. And I think we're going to come to that in the next 5 to 10 years. And I think Bitcoin and gold can both be a part of it. I know a guy, I think his name is Zach Townsend. He's doing great things, creating like Bitcoin related life insurance with a company called Meanwhile. There's another guy, Edward Woodford, I know, with Zero Hash, that's like putting like stable coins and digital assets on the monetary rails. So this can be used as transaction mechanisms. So there's like smart entrepreneurs all over the world putting things in place to make the digital assets happen. And then you also have these central banks in like India and China, like buying gold to bring back the discipline. And I think there can be a melding in the future of a digital asset and a gold-based system together, kind of like gold and silver almost, that come together to discipline central banks around the world and create, a happy medium between a restrictive gold standard and a crazy unleashed fiat system.
Are we moving into a multi-level world where, say, BRICS might be, take one part of the world. United States will focus on, South America, Central America, Canada, Greenland, Mexico, that region, and people just stay in their own lanes. Is that direction you guys see where this is going?
I
Marty, any
think
comments?
I think maybe temporarily. I mean, we've seen it, but I think at the end of the day, like all this, I do think we need to bring manufacturing home to the United States to a certain extent, but a division of labor exists for a reason. Their natural resources aren't evenly distributed across the world. There are places that have more precious metals and energy resources than others, and there's going to be a necessity to trade. I think that's part of what Trump is doing now. Is like I recognize that necessity, but I want to make sure the U.S. is being treated fairly, and so I think that's a great thing he's done out of the gate is really highlight that while people are screeching about tariffs, he's also educating like, hey, we're getting the shit end of the stick on a lot of these tariff deals. So I'm just bringing reciprocity to the market to make sure that we are getting our fair shake at global trade. Um, but yeah, I'm like I truly believe that if you have a neutral reserve asset, it becomes widely adopted. Uh, my focus is on Bitcoin, gold. I think I agree with Mel. I do think there will be people that there will be gold will be part of the neutral reserve asset story over the next couple of decades. But I think going back to correcting the ills of the fiat system that's been erected over the last 112 years, it's going to take time. And we're basically in the beginning phases of the recognition that we need to get back to sanity and tether the economic system to hard assets. And there will be individual countries and groups of countries that try to do their own thing. But I think at the end of the tunnel, once the market has fully reverted back to tethering the economy to sound money, the tension that will exist geopolitically will be significantly reduced because a lot of the tension that exists today revolves around the fact that the US is the reserve currency of the world and we have undue influence over that particular monetary system. And that is the outgrowth that we're seeing of the BRICS nations trying to create their BRICS currency or their SDR, whatever they're going after. And I think Biden in 2022 really accelerated that with the freezing of the treasury assets. So that was a moment in time where the United States basically told the rest of the world, we run the reserve currency system of the world. We can weaponize that against you at a moment's notice. And if you're on the wrong end of that weaponization, you're naturally going to say, we need to find an alternative to this and try to build it. And right now they're doing their thing. When you look at the countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, not the most stable countries in the world, and they have competing interests between themselves. And so my confidence in their ability to successfully create the next reserve monetary system or even a monetary system, reserve monetary system for their coalition, I'm highly skeptical of that. I think we're just in this phase of recognizing that Bitcoin is the perfect neutral reserve asset for the digital age. And there's going to be some volatility and learning processes along the way. And I think that's what this like BRICS SDR monetary system is a manifestation of. They recognize they need an alternative. They're trying to build it. They have not recognized that Bitcoin is the perfect alternative. And at the end of the tunnel, I think everybody's going to realize that Bitcoin is the perfect neutral reserve asset for the digital age, and that will become the Schelling point. And the world is sort of fracturing right now, but I think it will come back around that Schelling point of Bitcoin as this neutral reserve protocol.
What about the standpoint of the tariffs going on? And Trump announced yesterday what 25% tariff on automakers, which is so funny. Kind of coming back to what we were saying in the beginning of like people just still can't critically think common sense. Oh my god, I gotta go buy a car. They're gonna be much more expensive. this, that, Doge is going to lay us all off. They're coming for us. Are they doing this to get other countries to buy into this new model or the Mar-a-Lago Accord? To get them to because it's not going to work unless countries like China are buying into this. Is that what the goal is with the tariffs? Whoever wants to start.
Well, I would start with that, but I'd honestly, if you don't mind me, I'm just kind of curious because Marty, I know, I have the utmost respect for Bitcoin, and I know there's a lot of people in the Bitcoin world that just think Bitcoin is perfect as a monetary asset and, is much preferable to gold. Now, I'm not saying you believe that. I'm just saying I know there are people out there in the Bitcoin world who believe that. I'd be curious on your thoughts because I was watching a documentary the other day. And it was actually all about like the movements of gold as World War II happened.
Hmm.
And it was like, France was moving gold and Czechoslovakia, and they're doing this in the central banks. And Hitler's invading these countries, and like Czechoslovakian gold was like, under control of the Bank for International Settlements. And there's a bunch of stuff that happened around World War II where like French gold was moved out of Paris. And like, I'm like, how do central banks, if they were to use Bitcoin as that reserve asset, how do they like ensure that like the central bankers just go like who's the multi-sig authorities, right? Like let's say, I mean, we're not talking about a small amount. Like let's say we're talking about like trillions of dollars. Like Bitcoin becomes a monetary base and it's worth, as I've said, it could be at some point, trillions of dollars, and it's 10 million of Bitcoin. And like, who's controlling that on a central bank basis? And what happens if that country gets invaded? How do you handle that? Like, you still have those same difficulties, don't you? Just like Czechoslovakia did. Like, are there three central bankers that can handle the Czech, $1 trillion worth of Bitcoin? If they get killed or a gun to their head, they do it. And with gold, like you could theoretically say, okay, we're going to move this from Prague to Paris to vaults in uh, New York, and no one can get to it. So, wouldn't you have to admit, even as a pure Bitcoiner, there are certain advantages on a central bank international level to physical, in that physical has this ability to be put somewhere that the person in charge has no control over it.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned I'm reading Gold Warriors right now, which is the
Oh, yeah.
Japanese perspective on
Oh,
uh,
okay. It's
World
interesting. It's
War II
interesting.
and like how they right before World War II they were going and like raiding China, South Korea, taking all their
Mhm.
gold, put it in the Philippines, and
Mhm.
getting to the part where the U.S. government came in after the fact and found the gold and used it as a CIA slush fund. Um, so I'll say I'll answer your question first. I don't think in that scenario, like if a country central bank was like saw that there was a foreign threat coming
Yeah, like a
to
physical
attack.
army invades a
Yeah,
capital and takes over all central bank and political executives by gunpoint. How do you stop them from turning over the keys?
if I mean like in your example, World War II, like the French and many other countries saw the impending incursion by the Germans, and they proactively moved it. So I would imagine in this scenario, it would be similar. You have an idea that something's about to happen, so you could get the quorum of the multi-sig operators together to sign a transaction to move it to an American company that you
Okay.
trust or
Yeah.
something like that, or somebody else. But the more controversial thing is that I don't think central banks are going to exist. Like I think Bitcoin central banks exist to maintain monetary policy. Bitcoin has the perfect monetary policy. There is no need for a central banker. And I actually think what we're going to see under a Bitcoin standard is the reemergence of a free banking system where you have a bunch of private banks that pop up and they have a reserve of Bitcoin and they use something like a Chaumium Mint to issue banking services to their end clients. And so I'm actually partial towards the idea that ultimately over time Bitcoin completely renders central banks moot. The Bitcoin protocol is the central bank of the reserve asset of the world. And then on top of that protocol, you have a free banking system begin to emerge where private banks and maybe even government state chartered banks leverage the Bitcoin protocol to offer more competitive banking services to clients all over the world.
How,
No,
how do
no.
you, how do you how do you envision then if central banks don't exist, they're not going to just go away quietly into the night. So how would you see that playing out?
I mean the end they're going to kill themselves. The end state of fiat currency is such that you debase the currency. The monetary systems that they manage are going to be completely defunct. And this is crazy, crazy Bitcoiner here. Um, but over time, particularly in the hyper-connected digital world, where it's becoming clear that the free market is able to provide better goods and services, and we have the communication technology to really articulate to people that this is happening. Yeah, I think central banks get rendered moot. I mean, we lived the most prosperous times in the United States where when we didn't have a central bank, they're not going to go away quietly. They're going to go away kicking and screaming. But I think over time, this may take many decades. People just come to realize, like, why do we even need a central bank?
No, I'm with you completely, Marty, and I think people will look back at the pandemic as peak central bank, and that it'll be like a curve from like 1913 in the United States, ramping up, really gets a big juice in 2009 with the financial crisis, and then hits peak central bank like 2020, where like people look at people like a Bernanke or a Powell like they matter, and like they do matter, right? They're important, but I think people need to understand that's not always been the case. In fact, typically that's not been the case, right? I mean, central bankers are not normally like, I mean, throughout history in the Middle Ages, in 1694, William III founded the Bank of England. I don't think in like 1776, anybody in the United States was looking at the governor of the Bank of England and saying, you're who I need to worry about. They're worried about King George. And I think people have just like the central banks have gotten way too important. And I think slowly but surely, Trump, Besant, and Treasury are starting to strip that away. And I think on the one hand, you're going to have people that say, oh, that's scary. They're trying to take away. I think they're trying to reclaim powers that belong rightly within the elective three branches of the government. So when the Constitution was formed, right to print coin, not print. I shouldn't even say that because it's important to know the language, which was very specific in the Constitution, was coin money. Congress has no ability to print money constitutionally because believe me, the revolutionaries did not want to have anything to do with paper money, which was inflated away. The continental, there's a saying, worthless as a continental. The continental dollar was worthless. So in the Constitution, there was no ability for Congress to print money. Congress was granted the ability to coin money. And to have that taken away to a third party, which is literally owned on the 12 subsidiary reserve bank system, 100% by JP Morgan, Citibank, Wells Fargo. That's who owns the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Federal Reserve Bank of New York released a cap table in 2017. It was like 45% owned by JP Morgan, 22% of the shares were owned by Citibank. I mean, this is all like private knowledge or public knowledge. Nobody wants to talk about it. So getting rid of these central banks, I think, is happening, and it's being brought back into the Treasury. It's being back into Besant. He talks about control of the 10-year, and I think this is a big deal because if we initiate instead of the central banker being in charge, we have a neutral reserve asset being the disciplinarian, whether that's gold, Bitcoin, or mixture of gold, Bitcoin, silver would be great to me because I love silver. Like we could have gold, Bitcoin, and silver be this triumvirate of monetary authority that somehow controls the treasury's issuance of money and get rid of central bankers. I mean, because all they do is serve, commercial banks, which are their owners. So I do think we're seeing that. We're going to have a peak central bank moment. And I think already you're seeing, the dollar and bonds move around more off of statements by Treasury than off of the Fed. And the Fed is starting to become kind of, a sideshow.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think in this process of shedding ourselves of the central banks, let's go back to the commercial real estate example that I relayed earlier. Like the ability to acquire commercial real estate, you need debt. You need to take out a loan from a commercial bank or a private credit fund. But how is that? If you're taking it from a bank, they literally create the money out of thin air, and you go into debt over 10 years, and the equity that you have is the building, and you begin buying into the equity of that building over the course and the duration of that loan. Once you add, like, I think there's a unique opportunity here with Bitcoin specifically because Bitcoin's going through its monetization phase. And so if you wanted a way to accelerate the shedding of the central banking system from your life, and as you mentioned, Mel, the commercial banks are the owner of the central bank here in the United States. You need a way for the equity portion of your credit to outpace the debt portion. So like by injecting Bitcoin into this over a 10-year, like there's a point at which the equity that you own in Bitcoin, let's say year 5, year 7, is worth more than the original loan you took out to get the property in the first place. So you can completely defease that and still have equity left over in the form of the property and the Bitcoin. And so if you're looking for a way to, I guess, speculatively attack the credit markets by injecting Bitcoin into it, like this is the opportunity to do that.
Don't you
Yeah,
think?
I mean,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mel.
go ahead, Mike. I was just gonna say, what you need a real neutral reserve asset. Like this was always the reason that you had interest rates. Was like let's go back to like 1910, right? The whole idea is like I'm a rich guy, I've got $1,000. Do I want to put it into gold or do I want to invest it? And if I can put it into gold, and because of inflation, that gold is going to go up 4% a year, and I can't find an investment that does better, then I put it into the gold. And what happened is once you got the manipulation of rates, so you get the Federal Reserve buying T-bills, buying bonds. And in 2020, like what was the yield on a 10-year bond in 20 or 10-year note in 2020? It got down to like 80 basis points. So you had someone saying in 2020, for 10 years, I can get 0.8% return on my money, or I can invest it. That creates malinvestment. I mean, right? I mean, look at what your
Hmm.
return would be. Let's say you took $1,000 in 2020 and you put that in a 10-year note and you get 0.8% a year, right? So you're getting what? $1,000, you're getting $80 a year on that $1,000. Now look at what's happened to inflation. You've been killed. You've been slaughtered. Nobody would want to invest for 10 years into a government note in 2020 at 80 basis points. You have to be stupid. But people did it because of the Federal Reserve. If your basis is gold, if your basis is Bitcoin, and you say, wait a minute, in 2020, hey, the government's doing a bunch of crazy stuff. There's going to be inflation. If I put my money in gold or Bitcoin, what did gold or Bitcoin do since 2020? Right? In 2020, Bitcoin's up. I don't know. I mean, I know it peaked in like 60 so in 2021. So we'll be generous. Let's just say it's only up, 40% since the 21 high. All right, still, that's what, 40% in 4 years? Gold, same thing, and I know other people say don't equate gold and Bitcoin, probably, but gold's probably up 40%, since 2021. So both are up like 40% since 2021. Well, that's a big difference than 80 basis points. And so when you have a monetary system that's fair, that's based on Bitcoin and gold, which are fair, they paid you fairly. They said, Mel, you put $1,000 into gold, $1,000 into Bitcoin in 2020. In 2025, guess what you get? A lot more than $1,000. The treasury market didn't treat you fair. You put $1,000 into treasuries in 2020, and 5 years later, you got 1,100. It's ridiculous. So the whole thing about returning to a neutral reserve asset monetary system is that all of a sudden you get fair and efficient allocation of capital.
Hmm.
You don't get people throwing money off and saying, "Oh, well, I'm just going to buy real estate." Because if I don't use my dollars to buy real estate, then those dollars are going to be inflated away. And then you get a 40% rise in real estate, and then you get a bunch of 28-year-olds that can't afford to buy a house. And then they're miserable, and then they feel left out of the system, then they drop out of the system. And and you just create all of these social problems. This is what like Ron Paul, I'm sure if Satoshi Nakamoto was alive, he would agree, or around. Like the monetary system is so fundamental to our society. If you have a corrupt and debased monetary system and you base everything around that, you are going to corrupt and debase society. And if you move back to something that's uncorruptible, and some Bitcoiners say gold isn't, whatever. I don't want to get in those debates. If you move back to something that's uncorruptible, gold, Bitcoin, silver, tobacco, whatever has been used as money in the past, seashells, all of a sudden you get a better society. And I think as we get away from this fiat system, it's not a coincidence that if you look at 1971, when we went off the pretense of a gold standard to today, you have seen I wouldn't call it a collapse, but a crumbling of the tenements of society that is is really like if it just keeps going on, it's going to be horrible. So I don't want to even talk about where we're heading. If this goes on, we're literally heading for like some sort of a Mad Max world. But I think there are forces in place to try to stop it, and I'm hopeful they're going to be successful.
Which Mad Max, Thunderdome, Mel, or the new one?
Well, I don't know.
I'll
And
take
I don't
I'll
know.
take
Maybe
the
we need to
Thunderdome.
go
I'll take
there.
the Thunderdome one.
Maybe we just need to go there, Mike. I don't know. I was watching a World War One documentary yesterday. It was talking about all the cocaine that was given out to all the soldiers back then. Like Merck processed over 9,000 kilograms of cocaine on an annual basis for disbursement to soldiers during World War One. Like this is one thing I do want to add. Like the world is crazy. The world's always been crazy. Like you can go back to World War One, you can go back to the Civil War, you can go back to, the French Revolution, you can go back to the United States Revolution. Like you go back and you look and you think, wow, the world's a little crazy right now. Like the world ain't even close to crazy. Like you want to talk about crazy, like talk about like 1918 when every single nation is literally killing themselves and hopped up on cocaine. Like that was a kind of a crazy world. We're not there yet. I hope we don't get there, but like we're actually pretty sane. Like Xi Jinping's talking to Putin, Putin's talking to Trump. Like we're surprisingly got our shit together. Like we're a pretty well-behaved world of 7 billion people, and there's some problem in Ukraine and some problem in Israel and Palestine, and I don't want to do that in the Democratic Republic of the Congo is a big deal. But if you look at human history, like you go back 2,000 years and like 20% of adult males died of combat wounds. Like we're the most peaceful, well-organized, well-orchestrated society this planet's ever seen. And that's why I'm actually happy we're going to figure this all out. That's why I said in the beginning, I'm an optimistic person. But like people think we're like crazy and at our throats. We're not at our throats at all. Dude,
No,
dude, I'm in North Carolina, dude. Like people literally were like killing themselves by the thousands 150 years ago, American versus American. We're not at our throats, not yet.
no, and there's certainly outgrowths of this. Like again, Luigi populism, it exists, but I think many people, and Michael, we've talked about this before, but like just the ability to have this conversation and then broadcast it the way you do and the way I do. This is something that many people do not appreciate. We were born in this inflection point of the internet age where for the longest time, when what led to the bloodiest wars in human history was the fact that propaganda was a one-way machine. It was the government owned the means of media and distribution of communication and said to the populace, here's what's happening. Buy our war bonds, get strapped up, you're going to battle. This day and age, we can have this conversation. It's no longer one way. In fact, the government to populace means of propaganda is getting weaker and weaker by the day. The people to the government and to the other people propaganda is getting stronger and stronger by the day. So we have the ability to really voice our opinions on the direction of the world and hold authority to account, despite what many may think about our ability to do that today. It's never been easier to do that in human history than it is today. And it is having a meaningful impact on the policy decisions that are being made, particularly today. I think we're at a point now where the internet has basically been mainstream for a generation, and my generation particularly. I remember downloading AOL into my gateway computer in 1996 with a CD. Where the internet and the digital age has come since then is literally people can't fathom the amount of change that's happened because our brains don't work at that speed. But that change has happened. And I think, similar to Mel, I'm incredibly optimistic because I think the smartest people in the world are realizing how to leverage these tools, these communication tools, particularly to basically get a message out there. And there is information warfare. Alex Jones has been on that beat for many decades, but I think more people are aware that we're engaged in an info war and they are actively participating in it both ways now. And I think that's one thing. Like, look at this hat, this strategic reserve hat. Like, this is propaganda for Bitcoin right now. Like, and it is getting sent out there to millions of people, despite what the government may or may not want to do with the Bitcoin strategic reserve. I think we are just finally learning 30 years into the commercial adoption of the internet, how to harness it as individuals. And that's not to say that nefarious actors are harnessing it as well, aren't harnessing it as well, but I do truly have a ton of optimism in our ability to engage in the info war and actually win it because we have truth on our side at the end of the day.
What about, the whole idea of, I know decentralization is the goal, but don't you both think the powers that be, they're going to do as best they can to not allow that to happen?
They can try, but it's again in the digital age. I always fall back to this Rogan clip from one of his early podcasts where he's describing the internet and like trying to stop decentralization is a battle you're not going to win. It's like putting a 3-year-old in the middle of a salmon creek up in Alaska when the salmon are going upstream and expecting them to catch all the salmon. Information is free in these days. We have bouts of censorship and firewalls that pop up, but people are getting through the Chinese firewall from within China. Like you can try all you want, but the information is going to get out there. They don't like it, but it's happening despite what they want to happen anyway.
And I ask that because, with regards to like a CBDC, I mean, as long as somebody can control the switch, right, can control, the accounts, they can monitor you, they can, debank you, they can, restrict you. So that's why I have a hard time understanding how we can get decentralized, because it's already, like, to me, the infrastructure is already in place to keep this thing right in their control.
That's if you use their system, right? That's why Bitcoin exists, right? Because if you hold Bitcoin in a wallet that you control, there's nothing they can do to hit a switch to stop you from broadcasting a transaction. And that's what I worry about stablecoins. Everybody is very excited about stablecoins. The stablecoins certainly had their place as a transitionary tool.
Marty, could you touch on that? Not to interrupt you, but could you touch on that for people that don't know stablecoins? Just kind of a brief summary of it.
So stablecoins, Tether is the largest stablecoin in the world, and I think they will maintain that position into perpetuity. They launched in 2014, and they basically had a subsect of their user base that came to them and said, hey, we're having problems basically trading Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies because of the banking system. Is there any way that you could create a token that represents $1 that we could send over these blockchains to create efficiencies in our trading strategies? So they launched it, and I was at an event he was at, Paolo Ardoino, the CEO of Tether, and he was saying they expected the market cap of Tether to be like $100 million when they launched it. But once they launched it, what they found is the ability for individuals to access dollar derivatives, which are these stablecoin tokens, on these blockchains, is that there was a ton of demand for it, not only from the traders who wanted the ability to arb exchanges easily, but in emerging economies that were subjected to high bouts of inflation or dictatorial regimes, and they were looking for a dollar instrument that they could access, and the ability to download a cryptocurrency wallet and have stablecoins in there and essentially have a dollar balance was extremely useful to them. Many people think, why don't they just adopt Bitcoin? In many of these emerging economies, people cannot stomach the volatility of Bitcoin. They really needed dollar instruments, and the incumbent banking system cannot provide them with that. And so Tether sort of filled that gap, and it has amassed, I believe it's like almost $150 billion market cap over the last 11 years. And it's become a big, with the growth of Tether specifically, the way they manage their reserves when Tether are minted, they need to hold the dollars that they have in liquid reserves. And over time, that the most liquid reserve that they've used is short-term treasuries, notes, bills. And so what the government has seen is that Tether, in the face of this fracturing of the global monetary order, where you had the BRICS countries doing their own thing and dumping U.S. treasuries, Tether's actually filled a significant amount of that demand. I believe last year, Tether as a company with less than 150 people on their team was the seventh largest buyer of treasuries in the world. And so the government here in the United States has recognized stable coins as a sort of passive demand for treasury issuance moving forward, because they need to have their reserves in cash-like liquid instruments, and treasuries provide that service for them. And so what we're beginning to see in the United States is there's two bills that are being debated about whether or not they get implemented: the Stable Act and the Genius Act. And the whole impetus for this is to sort of solidify that stablecoins are here to stay, and that we want them to succeed, because they provide this, not only this passive demand for treasuries at a time when other countries are dumping them, but it helps maintain dollar hegemony in emerging markets. So you have people using dollar instruments instead of digital yuan or euro in other parts of the world. However, Tether is a centralized company. Paolo will admit this. He admitted it in DC. And to your point, Mike, like, many people are afraid of these central bank digital currencies and the ability to hit the switch to stop people from using a currency if they're making a transaction that the government doesn't like. This still exists on Tether. Like Tether is centrally issuing and redeeming the stable coins that they offer, and they have a bird's eye view of everything that's going on with Tether. And so that, when it comes to worrying about the nefarious state actors basically deciding what you can or cannot do with your money, that's one thing I would urge your audience just to be cognizant of. Is stablecoins are a big meme. The government's putting their support behind them, and I think in part it's because of that treasury demand that exists. But the other part is Tether's a central third party that can be coerced to prevent people from using their stablecoin or not use it. And that is why Bitcoin exists. It is this neutral, decentralized, distributed peer-to-peer cash system where the government cannot levy similar control. So when it comes to Tether, I've never used Tether. I've never used stablecoins. I'm an American citizen. Our monetary system is relatively stable compared to every other one out there. And so I don't have a use case for it. But when it comes to others that do not have the situation that I do, what I advise them is, like, just use Tether. Like, if you can't stomach the volatility of Bitcoin and you need dollar, you need a dollar stablecoin, keep as little as you can in Tether, but make sure for your long-term savings you're putting it in Bitcoin, which can't be controlled.
What about the whole idea of the sovereign wealth fund? And did you guys catch Howard Lutnick's interview last week?
Yeah, I did. I think going back to what Mel was saying earlier, the sovereign wealth fund, number one, we're running a deficit. Doesn't make sense. Like, sovereign wealth fund, in my opinion, should Like you should only flow assets into the sovereign wealth fund when you have a surplus, and those assets should only be neutral assets like gold or Bitcoin. Because if Howard Lutnick, if we do what he was saying, like we're going to buy equity stakes in Pfizer and Moderna, I think that creates some very perverse incentives
Isn't that
where
like
the
another
government.
Enron or something? Isn't that somebody? A listener said that to me when because we were talking to Dave and I, Dave and I were talking about that. Is that like an Enron scenario?
I don't know if it's Enron. I just know like the if the government owns a 10% equity stake in Pfizer and Moderna, and they have a 2021 like, hey, we need to protect ourselves from COVID, so all need to get this shot. The government's incentivized to reduce the ability for individuals to have bodily autonomy, which I don't like. And you saw this similarly with TikTok too, like holding Trump to account. Like they were talking, we're going to buy half of TikTok, and the government's going to hold it in the sovereign wealth fund. And this is right off the heels of not off the heels. I mean, he's been on a 10-year plus long crusade against fake news and the state. And with U.S. aid, we're finding out that tax dollars are going to media companies to propagandize the public. It's like, well, if you own 50% of TikTok, you essentially own 50% of a media platform. And who's to say those same perverse incentives can be introduced there? So when it comes to sovereign wealth fund, like we've seen it in Wyoming, Alaska, other states, other countries around the world. I think the most successful ones are the ones that keep it simple, stupid, and any excess cash flow rolls into the sovereign wealth fund, which buys the rights to oil revenues or hard assets like gold.
Well, he was talking about putting parks in there too.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense if you're like revenues from the national parks and you want to roll that into a sovereign wealth fund. Um, but again, we have a massive deficit, the largest deficit, as Mel pointed out earlier. Like, yeah, I don't see. And Mel, maybe you disagree. I don't know.
Well, I think with the sovereign wealth fund, I think what they want is they want an asset liability balance sheet like a bank has that they can expand and leverage. And then that gives them some sort of a monetary control in the same way that the Federal Reserve has a balance sheet that they can leverage, and they can buy and do things. So, like if you give the Treasury and you give the executive branch, let's say you just throw in trillions of dollars of assets, some land, this, that. And then you say, okay, we're gonna, use our bank connections with JP Morgan or somebody and say, you need to give us collateral on this. And then we want to get into like derivatives, contract. Like you basically get control of the money supply. I honestly believe, like Andrew Jackson wanted to get rid of the second central bank of the United States in the same way that Albert Gallatin, who was the Treasury Secretary under Thomas Jefferson, was, totally antithetical towards the first central bank of the United States. And then he kind of changed his mind. He got pushed into it. But Jefferson was, steadfast in getting rid of the central bank. So, in case anybody doesn't know, the Federal Reserve is the third central bank. So there was a central bank that was set up under Hamilton and Washington in the beginning of the country. It had a 20-year charter. Under Jefferson, it was let to expire, and we got rid of that first central bank. Eventually, another central bank came back. It was known as the Second Bank of the United States. Andrew Jackson got rid of that one, paid off the debt, and refused to renew the charter. That was in 1836. So from 1836 until 1913, we had no central bank. And basically what happened was we had like a coup in this country, basically. Like we had uh, Woodrow Wilson was the governor of New Jersey. He was courted by all of the big bankers, JP Morgan guys that went down to Jekyll Island in 1911, 1912 it was, came up with the idea for central bank, propped up the Woodrow Wilson campaign, and ran on two things, a central bank and an income tax. And Wilson was elected in November of 1912. In 1913, we got the income tax amendment, we got the Federal Reserve created. And the other thing was like, in a way, that election was a little thrown because the sitting president probably should have won, but he didn't because of a third party candidate. Teddy Roosevelt jumped into the 1912 election and split the Republican vote between, I think it was Taft was the incumbent president. And so basically, like this New Jersey academic governor dude, Woodrow Wilson from Princeton, gets injected into the White House by a bunch of New York bankers um, to create, the system we live in today. So come back full circle to everything I'm saying about the sovereign wealth fund is that historically the United States has not been subject to the whims of a central bank. This is not something that is like a constant, like we need oxygen to live. We do not need a central bank to operate as a country. Half of our time we've had one, half of our time we hadn't. You can argue about what are the benefits or whatever. I think we're moving to a period where the central banks pull back. Now, if you listen to Bloomberg or CNBC, they're going to talk about financial bank or central bank independence like the Pope, like it's some sort of a religious mandate from on high that if we do not have an independent central bank, Donald Trump is Adolf Hitler. Right? Oh my God, the executive branch is trying to reassert monetary authority. This is therefore a coup d'etat. That's what you will hear from CNN or anybody if they try to shove Powell and the Federal Reserve into the corner. My argument is that throughout history, the United States has had times when central banks have power and authorities, times when they don't. If we begin moving to a time where more of the monetary authority is invested in the Treasury through a sovereign wealth fund, that's not necessarily a bad thing. What I do think is that there needs to be a control mechanism on it and not necessarily the central bank, but it, again, a neutral reserve asset, gold or Bitcoin. Something that checks the government needs to be in place. Doesn't need to be Powell and the Federal Reserve, but it needs to be a physical barrier like a 21 million cap on Bitcoin or the millions of ounces of gold that get mined every year.
Yeah. And the beauty of this too is that we can begin forcing this transition without the government. Like again, what I'm focused on at 1031 private market. How do we help individuals acquire Bitcoin, hold Bitcoin, use Bitcoin smartly as a piece of collateral to acquire other assets in the economy? And I think it's gonna like meet in the middle, like the strategic reserve I'm wearing right now. That like the idea of the Bitcoin strategic reserve at the federal level. I would love to see it. I think it would help long term. Just again, going back to the debt to equity, like Bitcoin's going through its monetization. If the U.S. government acquires Bitcoin early enough, like you can reap the benefits of Bitcoin's monetization. But we're seeing at the state level as well. Texas, it has a strategic Bitcoin reserve at the state level, making its way through the legislature right now. Then individual balance sheets. America, on a per capita basis, I think the Americans own the most Bitcoin out of anybody in the world, and so we're beginning to see at every level, where it's federal level, state level, and what I'm focused on mostly is the private market. Like I think the private market is going to begin. We have a free market competition for money again, at least in the private market with Bitcoin reintroduced. And we're already beginning to see it's the very early stages, but people are making conscious decisions of, again, going back to the commercial real estate. Like I'm going to take out this loan because it has Bitcoin as collateral in it and not just the real estate. And so we're going to attack it from both ends. And I think what I'm fascinated about right now is the private market solving this problem. I hope the government solves its problems, but that's the beauty of Bitcoin. It gives you agency to not have to depend on that. And it is happening slowly but surely. Many people will deny that it's happening, but it's inarguable. It's in all the data. You can see the number of wallets, the market cap of Bitcoin, its brand recognition. It's similar to the internet in the 90s right now.
Trump.
Yeah, I think one other thing really quick, Mike, if I could add, just because I know I've been a little optimistic about things, but I do think it's also important to recognize like there's like always a give and take. So on the one hand, we have the internet, we have podcasts, we get to disseminate information in a way that was never possible. And on the other hand, there are potential for like government surveillance and intrusion and control over things that have never been possible before either. So I think what I do is I try to take just like a philosophical step back and say, we are in the midst of the continual tension, the continual battle between kind of state, individual liberty that existed 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago. And there are more state tentacles that can reach out in different ways, but there's also more tools for the people to fight back in different ways. And we're just continually going through it. And 200 years ago, if you wanted to say, screw it, I'm moving to a cabin in the middle of Wyoming and living off the grid, you could do that. And guess what? If you really want to do it, you could still do it today. So I think we're in this same situation where do you want to be a part of society, the body politic, you're going to have attention, government elite control, moneyed interests versus individual liberties. It continues. It's like we're involved in our eternal cat and mouse game. It continues, and I wouldn't be surprised if 100 years from now it's still going on with AI, all over the place playing a big part of it. Like I just don't think it ends. I don't think there's a solution. I don't think there's a winner or a loser. I think it's a continual game. It's like men versus women in marriage. Like it just never ends. Can't live with them, can't live without them. We are in a continual battle of freedom and liberty versus oppression and control that it has been going on for thousands of years and probably will be for thousands more.
Completely agree. It's the good men or hard men create good times create soft men create bad times create hard men. And I think as it stands today, like we're at the bottom there. We're at the bad times. And so if you're looking at the next 30, 40 years, it's good for us being alive now because the opportunity and the bend back towards freedom, I believe, is likely ahead of us. And I think the last 100 years, 112 years since the Federal Reserve was voted in, the Federal Reserve Act was voted in on Christmas Eve, mind you, when nobody was there
Christmas
to
Eve,
vote.
they did it. Yeah, they did.
We've been on this trajectory towards an Orwellian totalitarian political apparatus on the world. And I like you said, I think we've reached peak central bank.
Yeah.
Maybe not
A
peaked it to
sine wave. It's like a
Yeah.
sine wave, and you never get like the solution, but like maybe to your point is like maybe we're at like a bottom where we're starting to ramp up and get some of that positive, and maybe it'll turn in 40 or 50 years, but like we're somewhere in that middle of that sine wave, and it still keeps going, and I think we're in a positive note, like I think we're on an upswing and the consciousness is evolving, but that doesn't mean like there's going to be a final victory or a final defeat one way or the other.
No.
Trump and his team, I've talked to, people that have indicated if a recession is going to happen, it's better for it to occur in the beginning. That way, you're on the backside of it before the midterms next year. Other people are saying it's inevitable and that they're delaying the inevitable, but Trump maybe believes that they can get through this without a recession. What are your guys' thoughts on can we get through this without a recession based on what we've discussed over the last 90 minutes? Or is it inevitable?
Mel, you're much more equipped to answer this off the bat.
Oh, well, can we get I think it's going to be hard. I think it's not going to be easy, but I do think it's possible. So I think what we need to do is we need to have these policies be put in place, but at a certain time we need to start unleashing some of the positive animal spirit type stuff that sent the stock market up in November and December. Like massive deregulation, maybe some monetization. I've talked about, and I think this gets into a whole nother conversation that's too long for here. I know Marty, you have some time constraints, so like there's only so much that we can do, but there are things that are going to be able to be unleashed that I think are going to pull us back from a very deep recession, and I think that could include a monetization of gold. It could be the deregulation. They could create Doge dividend checks to stimulate the economy. Like what they're capable of doing to stimulate things is as outside of the box as what they're capable of doing on the tariff side. That's like unthinkable to like maybe constrain some of the free wheels moving of the economy. So I don't think that there's a need for there to be some great recession or crash. And the last thing I'll say is the key to the U.S. economy is the U.S. consumer. Key to the U.S. consumer is the job market. Key to the job market is shutting the border. If we didn't have Biden let in 10 million people, like wages would have just gone through the moon in the last 4 years, and real wages would be. So I think there's plenty of jobs in the United States. As long as you keep the border shut, people are going to be working, they're going to make money, economy is going to do okay.
Yeah, I think there's a case to be made. The real economy's been in a recession for a while, right? Like maybe all this deregulation, shutting of the border is us actually coming out of it. Like if you again going back to what is charge-off rates going up to 6, 7% for Discover and Capital One, Klarna and DoorDash feeling the need to launch a product that enables people to buy food with buy now, pay later, payday loans. Like that signals to me that in the real economy, people have been hurting due to the
No, definitely, definitely.
economic
Yeah.
policy. So the what is it, the NERP, which defines recessions. They may not have done it yet, but I think there's a strong case to be made that many people may even define it as a depression when you look at the
Yeah.
inability for young people to buy houses or to get good jobs and to sustain what they would deem to be a necessary quality of life. Like I think you can make a strong argument that we've already been in one, and Trump getting in, closing the border, deregulating the economy is us beginning to actually peak out of it.
Yeah. We've been in a recession in one sense for decades, like a real recession. Like if you took real inflation numbers and you didn't, manipulate the CPI, where you take out borrowing costs and you calculated it the way they did 40 years ago, and you place that up against actual economic growth, we would have been in a recession for the entire Biden administration. And if you look at real wages over a multi-decade period, and that's what we talked about in the beginning, was like this cannot continue. Like the Biden Harris plan could have gone on for a couple more years, but it just could not have continued this hollowing out and letting it all go down. In a lot of ways, we have been in a recession for decades, where the middle class has gotten less and less of a standard of living, and we need to turn that around in a way. And I think that's why you have to give a little bit of, you know, rope, a little bit of leash to say, look, maybe there'll be some ups and downs in the stock market or whatever, but I think they need to do it in a way that doesn't collapse the stock market, because that collapses tax receipts and that creates a financial collapse because the banking system collapses. So like like people should take a chill pill. I don't think the S&P is going to go down 50% and stay there. I've always said I think the S&P is going to go down about 20% this year and then quickly go back up. I've been saying that since December. So far we're about halfway there. I think we could go down another 10%. I think some of these inflationary ideas start flying, some of these deregulation type things, and we see an S&P end the year closer to 7,000 than 6,000. So, I'm optimistic, but I think there's a lot of volatility and craziness ahead in the next few months. And, it also provides opportunity.
Yeah, I think we may have had the catalyst for that temporary drop today with CoreWeave's IPO, them cutting the valuation on the IPO this morning. That's I think what's holding it up is Nvidia in the AI craze, and so I think deflating that hype bubble a little bit will spook markets for a time, and so we could literally have the pin pop for that continued correction today.
Mel, I know someone's going to probably message me. What was the name of the World War One documentary you were watching?
The one about the drugs and
Yeah,
stuff.
the cocaine.
Oh, it was a YouTube video, and who produced it, I don't know. But I would imagine if you search in YouTube, drug usage during World War I, like it would probably pop up. And it was something that, I mean, it was so wild. So like the German infantry actually had like a plan for everybody to get a standard issue of cocaine, But Merck, or GlaxoSmithKline or one of these German pharmaceutical companies, they couldn't meet the supply. And most of it actually back then wasn't from Colombia, it was more from Peru. Um, but there was a glut, there's like a need for this. And so the cocaine supply was a little light. But there were like they showed like articles and like advertisements in the New York Times, um, from like places that were advertising kits to send to your loved ones at the front. And these were from like really, elite, like New York firms, like a Tiffany or something, like a gold plated, like cocaine distribution, morphine, heroin system, basically. Like, I mean, it's all ridiculous. Like, people have no idea how much drugs were involved in World War One. Like studies have shown like something like 80% of combatants were on narcotics, while they were fighting at the front. Like this was just part and parcel of how they did it. It was part of the British regular issue. Like you got cocaine as part of your issue. I forget what they called it, but I mean, do the World War One search. It's like World War One cocaine usage. I mean, it's out of control. And the same thing happened in World War Two, by the way. Methamphetamines was a big thing in World War Two. The Nazis used to get it, and there were all these studies done. They're like, it will decrease appetite by 20%, increase stamina by 40%, and it was just like the perfect thing to give to people. So, I mean, basically, you had all of these millions of guys running around, hopped up on cocaine with machine guns, fighting each other. Like, if you think today's world is crazy, like, go back to 1918 and put yourself somewhere in Germany, and you're really gonna see crazy.
It's like the end of Scarface. End of...
Yeah.
Well, like part of the I can't stop thinking of the picture of the guy. I believe it was a German soldier or somebody like before the war and after the war, and he's aged like 2 decades, and like how it was the cocaine contributing to that
That was
more
all
than
they
the
had.
war.
They didn't have modern analgesic. They didn't have modern things. They had morphine, and then they had like cocaine. I mean, they had chewing gum cocaine. Obviously, cocaine was involved in part of the Coca-Cola beverages, so they could wash it down. They could take the British government developed capsule form pills of cocaine. Um, like this was just like literally like they issued, cigarettes with World War II soldiers. Basically, all everybody in World War One was issued cocaine. So that's the world that was going on 100 or so years ago. Was pretty much all white people on the planet were hopped up on cocaine, killing each other. That
Now
sounds a
they're
lot more crazy than now.
yeah, now they're just hopped up on hormone blockers.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And people wonder why the testosterone rate is down, the fertility rate is down. If you give everybody a bunch of ADHD medication or you give them a bunch of cocaine, let's see how many babies pop out. I mean, answer to the question, right?
And Ozempic, right? That's the other thing. They're up on Ozempic. Everybody's taking
Yeah.
Ozempic.
Yeah, no, it was crazy, man. It was a crazy world. I mean, it's like you can't even imagine it. Like you watch some of these documentaries and you see these people that are like 15, 16 years old and just being shipped out to the front. They have absolutely nothing on them. They can't read, they can't write. They know absolutely nothing about the world. They're handed a suit on their back, a machine gun to carry, and some cocaine, and said, go fight. Like that's Europe 110 years ago.
And some of them are barely 18, if not under 18.
Yeah, a lot of them were definitely.
Where can
Come a
people
long way.
Where can people find you, Mel?
melmadison.com, melmadison1 at Twitter. So anywhere there. I've got a book called Quaz. It's kind of a financial thriller about crazy central bankers manipulating monetary systems, and that's about it.
Marty.
Hang on an X lot. It's Marty Bent at Marty Bent, tftc.io, tftc.tv if you want to see the podcast,
What?
which Mel has been on. I need to get you on, Michael.
Anytime, man. I'm always game.
Yeah.
When's the next one coming out for you, and who can we anticipate?
Um, next, or actually tomorrow, we do a podcast called Bitcoin Alpha that'll come out on the platform. It's 1031. Just talking about. So Will Reeves from Fold, CEO of Fold, was on talking about their Bitcoin backed rewards program and their journey going public. So it's interesting if you're looking for a perspective on the Bitcoin companies in the space.
Last thing for both of you guys, donation wise, anywhere people can donate to what you're doing, all the work you're putting out. Mel?
No, just buy Quoz, Quoz on Amazon. It's a good book. That'd help me. But other than that, I just like to get the word out.
Yeah. Similarly, if you're just the way watch the podcast, if you want to learn more about what's happening on the venture side, you can hit me up. I can tell you about 1031.
Guys, as always, thank you individually for coming on here, and I appreciate both of you taking the time for the discussion today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Mic drop.